Sometimes the greatest battles aren't fought with sword and shield, but with the choice to open your heart when the world has taught you to close it. In the harsh mountains of ancient Norway, a lone Viking warrior is about to discover that kindness can be the most dangerous weapon of all. Bjorn Ketilsson returned from his hunt expecting an empty longhouse. Instead, he found two starving strangers by his fire. He reached for his axe to throw them out, but the old woman whispered something that stopped him cold. "We built this hall before you were born." These weren't just wanderers. They held secrets about his past and the Jarl who destroyed his family. When the village came to drive the old couple away, Bjorn faced a choice that would change everything. Would he choose the violence he'd always known, or risk everything to protect two people who meant nothing to him? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind howled through the mountain peaks like the voices of the dead, carrying with it the scent of snow and ancient stone. Bjorn Ketilsson stood in the doorway of his longhouse, his weathered hands gripping the doorframe as he stared at the two figures huddled by his hearth. The fire cast dancing shadows across their gaunt faces, and for a moment he wondered if the isolation had finally driven him to madness. He had built his life on solitude, choosing the harsh embrace of the mountains over the company of men who could betray him. The longhouse sat perched on a rocky outcrop, accessible only by a narrow path that wound through treacherous terrain. It was a fortress of loneliness, and that was exactly how Bjorn preferred it. The old woman looked up at him with eyes the color of winter sky, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of years lived in hardship. "You have your father's stance," she said softly. "Broad shoulders, ready to bear the world's burdens alone." Bjorn's hand moved instinctively to the battle axe hanging at his side, his father's axe, the only inheritance he had claimed from a life torn apart by treachery. The weapon had tasted blood in a dozen battles, had cleaved through shield and bone with equal ease. It was a tool of war, passed down through generations of warriors who knew that strength meant survival and mercy meant death. "I don't know what game you're playing, old woman," he said, his voice rough from disuse, "but you'd best speak plainly. How do you know my father?" The elderly man beside her stirred, his frail form wrapped in furs that had seen better days. When he lifted his head, Bjorn saw intelligence in his rheumy eyes, the kind that came from a lifetime of careful observation and hard-won wisdom. "Einvald Bjornsson," the old man said, and the name hit Bjorn like a physical blow. "A good man taken before his time. I knew him when he was younger than you are now, full of hope and dreams of building something lasting." Bjorn stepped back, his mind reeling. No one spoke his father's name anymore. The few who had known Einvald were either dead or had learned to forget lest they share his fate. Jarl Magnus had made sure of that, painting the Ketilsson line as traitors and oath-breakers before putting them to the sword. "Who are you?" Bjorn demanded, his voice carrying the edge of barely controlled violence. "Speak truth or find yourselves back in the snow." The old woman rose slowly, her joints protesting with age. Despite her obvious frailty, she carried herself with a dignity that spoke of better times. "I am Astrid," she said simply, "and this is my husband, Eilif. We are—" She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. "We are what remains of those who remember the time before Magnus's lies took root." Eilif struggled to his feet, and Bjorn could see the proud bearing that age and hardship hadn't quite managed to break. "This hall," the old man said, running gnarled fingers along the carved timber of the wall. "Every beam, every joint, every stone of the foundation, I placed them with these hands." The claim was outrageous, impossible. Bjorn had found the longhouse abandoned years ago, its previous owners long gone. He had claimed it by right of strength, as was the Viking way. The structure was old but sound, built by someone who understood both craft and purpose. But to suggest these frail wanderers had built it was the foundation stone, Eilif continued, his voice growing stronger with memory. "Beneath the central hearth. There's a carving there, hidden from casual sight. the intertwined serpents of the master builder's mark, with runes spelling out the prayer for a lasting home. Bjorn felt the blood drain from his face. He had discovered that very carving years ago, while making repairs, had wondered at its meaning, but dismissed it as the work of some long-dead craftsman. He had never mentioned it to another soul. "Impossible," he whispered, but even as he spoke, doubt crept into his voice. Astrid moved closer to the fire, her movements careful but purposeful. "You've lived here. How long?" "5 winters? 6? But the ghosts of memory run deeper than that. They can see the places where you've made changes, practical improvements for a warrior's needs. But the bones of this place, the heart of it, that remains as Eilif built it," she gestured to the great beam that ran the length of the hall's ceiling. "See how it curves just slightly? That's not accident or settling. Eilif shaped it that way, following the natural grain of the wood. He said a home should bend with the storms of life, not break against them. The observation was too precise, too specific to be coincidence. Bjorn had always admired that beam, had wondered at the skill of the unknown craftsman who had shaped it. But these two ragged wanderers claiming to be its creators— "You're lying," he said, but the conviction had gone out of his voice. "If you built this place, where have you been? Why come back now, when winter's grip tightens and provisions run low?" Eilif's face darkened, and for a moment Bjorn glimpsed the strong man he must have once been. "Because Magnus finally grew tired of hunting us across the 9 realms. Because we're old and tired and have nowhere left to run. Because," his voice broke slightly, "because this was our home long before it became yours." The fire crackled in the silence that followed, sending sparks spiraling up toward the smoke hole in the roof. Bjorn stared at these unlikely intruders, trying to reconcile their claims with everything he thought he knew. They were clearly desperate, clearly at the end of their strength. But there was something in their bearing, in the way they spoke of the Longhouse, that rang with truth. "Magnus," Bjorn said finally, testing the name like a blade's edge. "Jarl Magnus Ironhand?" "The same," Astrid replied, and there was a world of pain in those 2 words. "The man who styles himself protector of the northern clans while feeding on their misery, like a carrion crow." Bjorn's grip tightened on his father's axe. Magnus, the name that haunted his dreams, the face that appeared in every nightmare. The Jarl who had twisted words into weapons, turning friend against friend, until Bjorn's entire world had collapsed in blood and screaming. "He destroyed my family," Bjorn said quietly. "Branded my father a traitor, put mother and sisters to the sword. I was hunting in the deep woods when his men came. Returned to find nothing but ash and accusations." Eilif nodded grimly. "That's his way. Eliminate those who might challenge him, then rewrite history to justify the deed. We knew your father, boy. Einvald was many things, but traitor was never among them." The admission hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Bjorn felt something crack inside his chest, a wall he had built around his heart to keep the pain at bay. For years, he had wondered if perhaps the accusations were true, if some weakness in his father had brought doom upon them all. To hear otherwise, from strangers who claimed to have known Einvald, "Why should I believe you?" he asked, but the question came out as a plea rather than a challenge. Astrid stepped closer, moving with the careful grace of a woman who had learned to make herself small in a dangerous world. "Because you know in your heart that your father was a good man. Because you've spent years in exile, punishing yourself for crimes you didn't commit. Because—" she reached out as if to touch his arm, then seemed to think better of it. "Because we're all that's left of the truth, and truth deserves a voice." Bjorn looked between them, these unlikely bearers of impossible claims. They were thin to the point of starvation, their clothes patched and repatched until more thread than original fabric remained. But their eyes held steady, and in Astrid's weathered face, he saw something that reminded him painfully of his own mother. "If what you say is true," he said slowly, "if you truly built this place, then you know it was made to shelter a family. Children's laughter in the rafters, women's songs by the loom, not the bitter solitude of a broken warrior." Eilif agreed sadly. That was always the dream. But dreams die hard deaths in times like these. Astrid moved to the small alcove, where Bjorn kept his meager provisions. Without asking permission, she began sorting through what remained: dried meat, coarse bread, a handful of withered apples from his last trip to the village. "When did you last eat a proper meal?" she asked, not looking at him. "I eat what I need," Bjorn replied stiffly. "That's not what I asked." She turned to face him, and her expression was stern despite her frailty. "A man can survive on little more than will and stubbornness, but he cannot truly live. When did you last share food with another soul? When did you last speak words that weren't curses or commands to your horse?" The questions cut deeper than any blade. Bjorn realized he could not remember the last time he had eaten in company, the last time his voice had been raised in anything approaching conversation. He had become a ghost, haunting his own life, sustained by purpose, but nourished by nothing that truly mattered. "I need no company," he said. But the words rang hollow even to his own ears. "Perhaps not," Astrid conceded. "But company needs you. Eilif and I have spent 3 days without food, walking through snow that reached our knees. We had given up hope when we saw the smoke from your chimney. If you turn us out now, we'll not survive another night." The simple statement hung between them like a sword suspended by a thread. Bjorn looked at these two fragile souls, imagined them struggling through the mountain passes with nothing but determination keeping them upright. The warrior in him counseled caution. Every stranger was a potential threat, every act of kindness a weakness to be exploited. But another part of him, a part he had thought long dead, whispered of duty and honor and the sacred obligation to protect those who could not protect themselves. "The winter stores are limited," he said finally, his voice carefully neutral. "I planned for 1, not 3. We asked for little," Eilif said. "Shelter from the wind, a place by the fire. We can work for our keep. These old hands still remember useful skills." Bjorn studied them both, weighing options that all seemed fraught with danger. To shelter them was to risk his own survival if their claims proved false, if they were spies or agents of his enemies. But to turn them out into the bitter night was to become the very thing he despised, a man who had lost his humanity to the harsh necessities of survival. "1 night," he said at last. "You may stay 1 night, share what warmth the fire provides. Come morning, we'll speak again of what's to be done." Relief flooded Astrid's features, and she sagged slightly as if the strength that had carried her this far was finally beginning to fail. "Thank you," she whispered. "Whatever else transpires, know that your kindness tonight means more than words can say." Eilif nodded gravely. "The measure of a man isn't found in his strength of arm or sharpness of blade. It's found in the choices he makes when no one is watching, when mercy costs him more than cruelty." As the 3 of them settled around the fire, 2 ancient wanderers and 1 bitter warrior, none of them could have guessed how those simple words would echo through the trials to come. Outside, the wind continued its mournful song, but within the walls of the Longhouse, something warmer than flame began to kindle, something that had been absent from these halls for far too long, the fragile beginning of hope. Dawn broke grey and cold over the mountain peaks, casting long shadows through the smoke hole above. Bjorn woke to the unfamiliar sound of quiet conversation, the soft murmur of voices that spoke of shared years and comfortable intimacy. For a moment, he lay still on his sleeping furs, disoriented by the presence of others in his sanctuary. Astrid was tending the fire, coaxing life from the embers with practiced efficiency, while Eilif sat nearby, running his weathered hands along the carved supports of the great hall. There was something reverent in the old man's touch, as if he were greeting old friends after a long absence. "The joints are still true," Eilif was saying quietly. "No settling, no weakness in the binding. Good timber, properly seasoned. This hall will stand for generations yet." Bjorn rose silently, his warrior's instincts cataloguing the subtle changes in his domain. His guests had not disturbed his weapons or provisions, had not even moved from the area immediately around the hearth. Yet their very presence had altered something fundamental about the space, made it feel less like a fortress and more like a home. "You speak as if you know every beam and board," Bjorn said, causing both elderly figures to turn toward him. "Because I do," Eilif replied simply. "Come, I'll show you something that will settle your doubts once and for all." The old man struggled to his feet, his movements stiff with age and the previous day's exertion. He walked slowly to the central hearth, where the great foundation stone lay partially hidden beneath generations of soot and ash. "Help me clear this away," Eilif said, kneeling with obvious difficulty beside the stone. Despite his lingering suspicion, Bjorn found himself complying. Together, they swept away the accumulated debris, revealing the full surface of the carved stone beneath. What they uncovered made Bjorn's breath catch in his throat. The stone was covered in intricate runic carvings, far more elaborate than the simple marking he had glimpsed years ago. Intertwined serpents formed a border around the edge, their bodies creating an unbroken circle of protection. Within that border, carefully carved runes spelled out not just a prayer for a lasting home, but something far more significant, a family genealogy, stretching back through multiple generations. "My mark," Eilif said, pointing to a complex symbol at the stone's center. "The sign of Eilif the Builder, master of the guild. And here," his finger traced along a line of runes, "the names of those for whom this hall was first raised." Bjorn leaned closer, his knowledge of the old writing allowing him to piece together the meaning. The names carved there were ancient, but one in particular made his heart race. Ketil Eriksson, his grandfather's grandfather, a name he knew only from half-remembered stories told by firelight. "This is impossible," Bjorn whispered. "This stone, these carvings, they would take days to complete. You couldn't have done this in a single night." Astrid approached, her expression gentle but firm. "We didn't do this last night, dear one. Eilif carved this stone 43 years ago, when we were young, and the world seemed full of promise. When your grandfather commissioned this hall as a wedding gift for your grandmother," the revelation hit Bjorn like a physical blow. His grandfather, the stern warrior whose stories had shaped his childhood, had built this place. The Longhouse wasn't some abandoned ruin he had claimed by right of strength. It was his birthright, his family's legacy. "You're saying this hall belongs to my bloodline." "More than that," Eilif said, his voice carrying the weight of painful memory. "This hall was meant to be the seat of your family's power, the center from which the Ketilsson line would lead and protect their people. Your grandfather had dreams of uniting the scattered mountain clans, of building something lasting and good. What happened?" Bjorn asked, though part of him already knew the answer. Astrid's face darkened. "Magnus happened. He was young then, ambitious and clever. He saw the threat that a united clan posed to his own aspirations. So he began to whisper poison in the right ears, to sow doubt and suspicion among those who should have been allies." Eilif nodded grimly. "It started small. Questions about the legitimacy of your grandfather's claims, rumors about divided loyalties. Magnus was careful, patient. He let others do the heavy work of accusation while keeping his own hands clean. He convinced the other clan leaders that your grandfather was growing too powerful," Astrid continued, "that the Ketilsson line threatened the traditional balance of power. By the time anyone realized the truth, it was too late." Bjorn stared at the foundation stone, trying to process the implications of what he was hearing. "You're telling me that my entire family line was destroyed because of one man's ambition?" "Not just your line," Eilif said sadly. "Magnus has been playing this game for decades, eliminating anyone who might challenge his authority. We were among the first to feel his reach. What did you do to earn his enmity?" Astrid and Eilif exchanged a look heavy with shared pain. "We knew too much," Astrid said finally. "Eilif had built halls for many of the clans Magnus targeted. We could connect the pattern of his betrayals, could prove that the accusations against your family and others were fabricated. So he branded us as traitors too," Eilif added. "Claimed we were part of a conspiracy to overthrow the legitimate order. We barely escaped with our lives, lost everything we had built over a lifetime of honest work. Bjorn felt a cold rage building in his chest, the familiar fire that had sustained him through years of exile. But alongside the anger was something else, a grief so profound it threatened to overwhelm him. His family's destruction hadn't been the result of fate or misfortune. It had been orchestrated, planned, executed with cold precision. How many others? He asked quietly. Dozens, Astrid replied. Entire family lines erased, their names struck from the memory of their own people. Magnus rewrites history as easily as other men sharpen blades. Bjorn rose abruptly, pacing to the far end of the hall. The carved timbers that had seemed merely well-crafted before now revealed themselves as something more, a legacy, a testament to his family's dreams and aspirations. Every beam, every joint spoke of hope and permanence, of a future that had been stolen before it could fully bloom. Why didn't anyone stop him? He demanded, turning back to face his unexpected guests. Who was left to try? Eilif asked. Magnus was clever. He eliminated the leaders first, the ones with the strength and legitimacy to challenge him. By the time the common folk realized what was happening, resistance seemed hopeless, and those who did try to speak out found themselves facing the same accusations that had destroyed their betters. Astrid added. Magnus had created a web of fear and suspicion that made trust impossible. Bjorn looked down at the foundation stone again, at the careful runic script that spelled out his family's proud history. All these years, he had believed himself to be the last remnant of a disgraced line, a survivor carrying the weight of his father's supposed crimes. To learn that the disgrace itself was a lie, that his family had been destroyed, not for their failures, but for their virtues. This hall, he said slowly, was meant to be the center of something greater, a beacon of hope, Eilif confirmed. A place where justice and honor could flourish, where the strong protected the weak instead of preying upon them. Your grandfather died before he could complete his vision, but the foundation was laid, literally and figuratively. Astrid moved to stand beside Bjorn, her presence somehow comforting despite her frailty. The question now is what you choose to do with this knowledge. You could continue as you have, isolated, bitter, living only for your own survival. Bjorn prompted, or you could reclaim what was stolen from your bloodline, not through conquest or revenge, but by becoming the man your grandfather dreamed of raising. By finishing what he started, the suggestion hung in the air between them, charged with possibility and danger in equal measure. Bjorn felt the weight of generations pressing down upon him, the accumulated hopes and dreams of ancestors he had never truly known. Magnus has grown powerful, he said finally. His reach extends across half the northern territories. What could one man do against such an adversary? Eilif smiled, and for a moment Bjorn glimpsed the master craftsman the old man had once been. One man, nothing. But one man with the right cause, surrounded by others who remember what honor means. That's how mountains are moved, as if summoned by his words. A sound drifted across the mountain peaks, the distant baying of hounds, growing steadily closer. Bjorn's blood chilled as he recognized the distinctive call of Magnus's hunting pack. The beasts the Jarl used to track his enemies across the wilderness. They found us, Astrid whispered, her face pale with fear. Bjorn moved to the window, peering out at the steep path that led to his stronghold. In the distance, moving steadily upward through the snow, he could see the dark shapes of mounted men. Magnus's hunters, following a trail that could only lead to his door. The moment of reckoning had arrived far sooner than any of them had expected. Within hours, perhaps less, the sanctity of his mountain refuge would be shattered. And with it, any hope of learning more about the legacy that had been stolen from his bloodline. Unless, of course, he chose to fight for it. The sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed off the mountain walls like thunder before a storm. Bjorn moved with practiced efficiency, securing shutters and checking the heavy oak bar that reinforced his door. Years of solitary living had taught him to prepare for siege, but never had the stakes felt so personal. How long do we have? Astrid asked, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. Bjorn peered through a gap in the shutters, counting the distant figures. An hour, perhaps less. The path is treacherous. They'll have to dismount and lead their horses for the final approach. Eilif struggled to his feet, moving toward a corner of the hall where broken timbers and old tools lay forgotten. Then we use that time wisely, he said, beginning to sort through the debris. A hall built for defense can still defend if we remember how. For a moment, Bjorn watched the old man work, struck by the transformation. Gone was the frail wanderer of the previous night. In his place stood someone who understood the bones of this building better than Bjorn himself. Eilif's weathered hands moved with purpose, selecting pieces of wood and iron with the eye of a master craftsman. "What are you doing?" Bjorn asked. "What I should have done years ago," Eilif replied, hefting a length of sturdy oak. "This hall was built to shelter a family, but it was also built to protect them. The original design included defensive features. I just need to remember where I put them." Astrid had moved to examine the simple loom that sat abandoned in the corner, its frame broken and strings long since rotted away. She ran her fingers along the wooden frame. With the same reverence, Eilif showed the building's structure. "I wove my first tapestry on a loom just like this," she said softly. "When we were first married, when we believed the future held nothing but promise." She looked up at Bjorn. "Do you know how to prepare food for more than one?" The question caught him off guard. "I eat what I need to survive, nothing more." "That's not living, that's merely existing," she said with gentle firmness. "A proper meal shared with others, that's one of the foundations of civilization. It's what separates us from the beasts of the field." Despite the approaching danger, Bjorn found himself drawn into their purposeful activity. Astrid began organizing his meager provisions with an efficiency that spoke of years managing a household. While Eilif worked to restore defensive features Bjorn hadn't even known existed. "Here," Eilif called from near the main door. "Help me with this stone." Together, they pried up a section of flooring, revealing a hidden cache beneath. Inside, carefully wrapped in oiled leather, were weapons and tools of exceptional quality. A war hammer with intricate engravings, several spears with leaf-shaped points, and shields bearing the Ketilsson family crest. "Your grandfather's armory," Eilif explained. "I built this hall with hidden stores throughout, weapons, food, even escape routes if needed. Magnus may have stolen your family's reputation, but he never found their preparations." Bjorn lifted the war hammer, feeling its perfect balance in his hands. The weapon was heavier than his father's axe, but somehow felt more natural, as if it had been crafted specifically for him. Along the handle, carved runes spelled out the name Ketil the Strong, his great-grandfather, a warrior of legendary prowess. "They prepared for war," Bjorn observed. "They prepared for the defense of what mattered," Astrid corrected gently. "There's a difference, though the distinction is often lost on those who profit from conflict. As they worked to prepare the hall, something remarkable began to happen. The space that had felt like a cold fortress started to transform into something warmer, more alive. Astrid's efforts to organize and improve their surroundings brought order to chaos, while Eilif's restoration of defensive features reminded the building of its original purpose. And Bjorn, for the first time in years, Bjorn found himself working alongside others toward a common goal. The sensation was strange, almost uncomfortable at first. He had grown accustomed to the weight of solitary decision-making, to answering to no one but himself. But as the three of them fell into an easy rhythm of cooperation, he began to remember what it felt like to be part of something larger than his own survival. "You move like a warrior," Eilif observed as Bjorn helped position a heavy beam to reinforce the door. "But you think like a builder." "Your grandfather would be proud." "I know nothing of building," Bjorn protested. "You know more than you think," Astrid said, pausing in her work to study him. "The way you've modified this hall over the years, every change serves a purpose, improves function without compromising the original design. That's not the work of a simple warrior." Bjorn looked around the hall with new eyes, seeing his own improvements as if for the first time. The raised sleeping platform that provided a better view of the approaches. The additional storage alcoves he had carved into the walls. The clever redirection of the smoke hole to reduce drafts while maintaining proper ventilation. He had made these changes instinctively, never considering that they might reflect inherited knowledge. "Your blood remembers what your mind has forgotten," Eilif said quietly. "The Ketilsson line has always understood that true strength comes from creating rather than destroying." The sound of hoofbeats grew closer, accompanied now by voices calling commands. Magnus's hunters were making better time than Bjorn had anticipated. Within minutes, they would be at his door, demanding entrance and answers. "We should prepare for parleying," Astrid said, reading his thoughts. "They'll want to talk before they resort to violence. Magnus prefers to corrupt rather than destroy when possible. You think they'll negotiate?" "I think they'll try to convince you that surrender is your only option," she replied. "Magnus has spent decades perfecting the art of making resistance seem hopeless. He'll offer you terms that sound reasonable, perhaps even generous, while making the alternative appear catastrophic." Eilif nodded grimly. "He destroyed our lives the same way. First the whispered suggestions that cooperation would be rewarded, then the implicit threats against those we cared about. By the time we realized we were in a trap, the jaws had already closed." Bjorn hefted his great-grandfather's warhammer, feeling the weight of generations in his hands. "And if I refuse his terms?" "Then we discover whether this old hall remembers how to protect its rightful owners," Eilif said with grim satisfaction. The first shouts echoed from the path below, harsh voices demanding that the inhabitants show themselves. Magnus's men had arrived, and with them, the first true test of whether three unlikely allies could stand against the forces that had scattered their families to the winds. Astrid moved to stand beside the hearth, her posture straight despite her obvious frailty. "Whatever happens," she said quietly, "remember that you are not alone. For the first time in years, you are not alone." The simple statement carried more weight than any weapon, more comfort than any shield. As the pounding began on the heavy oak door, Bjorn realized that something fundamental had changed in the span of a single day. He was no longer just a bitter exile nursing old wounds. He was the heir to a legacy worth defending, and he was no longer facing that responsibility alone. The time for hiding was over. The reckoning his family had been denied for generations was finally at hand. The pounding on the door ceased abruptly, replaced by a voice that carried the authority of long command. "Open in the name of Jarl Magnus Ironhand. We seek only words, not warfare." Bjorn exchanged glances with his unlikely companions. Through the narrow gap in the shutters, he could see armed men positioned around the hall's perimeter. A dozen warriors at least, their weapons drawn, but not immediately threatening. They had come prepared for resistance, but seemed willing to try diplomacy first. "They know you're here," Astrid whispered, her eyes fixed on the door. "Magnus wouldn't send so many men for a simple search." Eilif moved carefully to another window, his movements belying his apparent frailty. "Look there," he said quietly, pointing to a figure standing apart from the main group. "The one with the silver arm ring. That's Hakon the Tracker. Magnus only sends him when the quarry is specifically identified." Bjorn studied the man Eilif had indicated. Tall and lean, with the patient bearing of a professional hunter, Hakon carried himself with the confidence of someone who had never lost a trail. If Magnus had sent his best tracker, it meant their presence here was no accident. "How did they find us so quickly?" Bjorn asked. "The same way they've found everyone else Magnus once silenced," Astrid replied bitterly. "Gold buys many tongues, and fear loosens many more. Someone in the valley settlement saw us passing through." The voice outside called again, more insistent now. "Bjorn Ketilsson, we know you shelter enemies of the realm. Open your door, and we may yet find terms that serve all parties." Bjorn felt his jaw clench at the use of his name. For years, he had been nothing more than the hermit of the high peaks, a ghost story told to frighten children. To hear his identity spoken aloud by Magnus's men felt like a violation, a stripping away of the anonymity that had been his only protection. "They want us to respond," Eilif observed. "Silence will only confirm their suspicions. What would you have me say?" Astrid straightened, and despite her worn clothing and obvious exhaustion, She carried herself with regal bearing. "Tell them the truth, that you offer shelter to travelers, as honor demands. Make them be the first to speak of accusations and threats." Bjorn approached the door, but didn't remove the heavy bar that secured it. "I hear you," he called back. "State your business, then be on your way. These mountains offer poor hospitality to large groups." A different voice answered, younger, with the eager tone of someone trying to prove himself. "We seek 2 fugitives from the Jarl's justice. Thieves and oath-breakers who fled the settlement below. You will surrender them or face the consequences of harboring criminals." "Thieves?" Bjorn replied, injecting genuine puzzlement into his voice. "What manner of thieves travel the mountain passes in winter? What did they steal? Snowflakes and bitter wind?" The question provoked a brief consultation among the men outside. Bjorn could hear urgent whispers, the sound of a plan being adjusted on the fly. Whatever story they had prepared clearly hadn't accounted for reasonable questions. Hakon's voice cut through the muttering. "Enough games, Mountain Man. We know the old ones are with you. We know who they are and what they represent. The only question is whether you'll see reason or share their fate." The threat was naked now, the diplomatic facade abandoned. Bjorn felt the familiar heat of battle rage building in his chest, but something else tempered it, a cold, calculating anger that surprised him with its intensity. These men hadn't just come for Astrid and Eilif. They had come to eliminate witnesses to Magnus's crimes. And what fate is that? Bjorn called back, stalling for time while his mind raced through possibilities. "The fate of all who challenge the rightful order," Hakon replied. "Magnus Ironhand is patient, but not infinitely so. He offers one chance for redemption. Surrender the fugitives, accept compensation for your trouble, and return to your hermit's existence with no further interference." Beside him, Eilif had produced something from his worn clothing, a ring of tarnished silver, its surface carved with intricate patterns that spoke of noble lineage. The old man's hands shook slightly as he held it, and Bjorn could see tears gathering in his rheumy eyes. "What is that?" Bjorn whispered. "Proof," Astrid answered for her husband. "The signet ring of House Ironhold, granted to Eilif by the previous Jarl for services to the realm. Magnus had it declared forfeit when he branded us traitors, but we kept it hidden." Bjorn stared at the ring, understanding its significance immediately. In the complex web of clan politics, such tokens carried immense weight. They were proof of legitimacy, of oaths sworn and honored. For Eilif to have kept it all these years, despite the danger it represented, "It proves we were who we claimed to be," Eilif said quietly. "Before Magnus rewrote history to serve his purposes, this ring was granted for the halls I built, the lives I helped improve. It represents 40 years of honest service to the realm." The implications struck Bjorn like a physical blow. If Eilif possessed legitimate credentials from the previous Jarl, it meant Magnus's accusations against him were demonstrably false. More than that, it meant there was documentary evidence of the pattern of betrayals that had destroyed so many families. "They cannot know you have this," Astrid whispered urgently. "Magnus has spent decades ensuring such proof disappeared. If word spread that evidence of his crimes still existed, the other clans might begin to ask uncomfortable questions," Bjorn finished, his mind racing through the possibilities. Outside, Hakon was growing impatient. "Your silence speaks volumes, Mountain Man. Will you see reason, or must we demonstrate the futility of resistance?" Bjorn looked around the hall that had become something more than a refuge. It had become a sanctuary for the last witnesses to a decades-long campaign of systematic destruction. Astrid and Eilif weren't just refugees. They were living proof that Magnus's rise to power had been built on lies and murder. "I need time to consider your offer," Bjorn called back, hoping to buy precious minutes to think. "Time is a luxury you cannot afford," Hakon replied. "You have until the sun touches the western peaks to make your choice. After that, we take what we came for, with or without your cooperation." The ultimatum hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Bjorn calculated quickly. Perhaps an hour remained before sunset. An hour to decide whether to sacrifice two innocents for his own safety or risk everything to protect them. But as he looked at Astrid and Eilif, at the dignity they maintained despite their desperate circumstances, he realized the choice had already been made. These weren't just strangers seeking shelter. They were the keepers of his family's true legacy, the only witnesses to crimes that demanded justice. "Whatever we do," he said quietly, "we do it together." Astrid smiled through her tears, while Eilif gripped his clan ring with white-knuckled determination. Outside, Magnus's hunters waited with the patience of professional killers, confident that fear would accomplish what force might not. They had no idea they were dealing with the last inheritor of a bloodline that had never learned to surrender. The hour passed like winter's breath across stone, swift and bitter cold. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, a new sound reached them through the shuttered windows, the scrape of parchment being unrolled, the ceremonial clearing of throat that preceded formal proclamation. "Bjorn Ketilsson." Hakon's voice rang out with official authority. "By order of Jarl Magnus Ironhand, rightful lord of the Northern Territories, you are commanded to surrender the fugitives Astrid and Eilif, enemies of the realm and thieves of sacred property." Bjorn felt his blood turn to ice. The formal language, the specific naming, this wasn't a hunting party following rumors. This was an official execution detail, complete with legal justification prepared in advance. "Sacred property?" Astrid whispered, her face pale with understanding. "They mean the ring." "Somehow they know about the ring." Eilif clutched the silver band tighter, his knuckles white with strain. "Impossible. We've kept it hidden for 20 years. No one knew." "Someone always knows," Bjorn said grimly, moving to peer through the gap in the shutters. "The question is whether they betrayed you willingly or under duress." The messenger's scroll crackled in the mountain wind as Hakon continued reading. "Furthermore, the said fugitives are accused of bearing false tokens of authority, claiming rights and privileges not rightfully theirs, and spreading seditious lies regarding the character and legitimacy of their betters." The words struck like hammer blows. Magnus hadn't just sent men to eliminate inconvenient witnesses. He had crafted an entire legal framework to justify their murder. In the complex world of clan politics, possession of another's signet ring could indeed be construed as theft, especially if the original grant was declared invalid. "Clever," Bjorn admitted with grudging respect for his enemy's thoroughness. "He's not just destroying you, he's making your destruction legal, even honorable." "That's always been his way," Astrid said, her voice heavy with bitter experience. "Magnus never simply kills his enemies. He corrupts the very idea of justice until murder becomes duty." Outside, the formal proclamation continued. "Any who shelter these criminals share in their guilt. Any who resist lawful arrest face the same penalty. The mercy of the Jarl extends to all who cooperate, but his justice falls swiftly upon those who defy rightful authority." Bjorn studied the positioning of the men through various gaps in his defenses. They had spread out in a loose circle, cutting off all obvious escape routes. But Eilif had mentioned hidden passages, emergency exits built into the hall's original design. "Perhaps there," Eilif whispered, pointing to a section of the eastern wall. "Behind that tapestry, I built a passage that leads to the old shrine, then down to the hidden ravine. If we move quickly—" "No," Bjorn said firmly. "Running solves nothing. Magnus will simply send more hunters, and next time we won't have the advantage of preparation." "Then what do you propose?" Astrid asked. 3 against 12 is poor odds, even with the walls to help us." Bjorn hefted his great-grandfather's warhammer, feeling the weight of inherited purpose in its perfect balance. "Not 3 against 12, he said slowly. 1 against 12, while 2 escape to carry the truth to those who need to hear it." "Absolutely not," Astrid said with surprising steel in her voice. "We didn't survive 20 years of exile just to watch another good man die for our sake." "She's right," Eilif agreed. "Besides, You're thinking like a warrior when you need to think like a builder. The question isn't how to fight them, it's how to make fighting them costly enough that they reconsider their options. Before Bjorn could ask what he meant, a new voice called from outside, younger than Hakon's, with the eager cruelty of untested ambition. "Enough ceremony," the voice declared. "The sun touches the peaks. Time for words has passed." Through the gap in the shutters, Bjorn saw a figure step forward from the main group. Young, well-armed, with the restless energy of someone trying to prove himself worthy of greater trust. The kind of subordinate who made dangerous situations worse through excessive zeal. "Patience, Grim," Hakon replied, but there was warning in his tone. "The Jarl values results, not haste. The Jarl values those who get results quickly," Grim shot back. "Every moment we waste here is a moment the Old Ones might escape through some hidden passage." The exchange revealed useful information. Grim was ambitious and impatient, the kind of weakness that could be exploited. More importantly, they clearly knew about the possibility of escape routes, which meant someone had provided detailed intelligence about the hall's construction. "Someone told them about the passages," Bjorn murmured. "Not possible," Eilif protested. "I shared those secrets with no one save—" His face went ashen. "Save my apprentice, young Tormund, who helped with the final construction. But he died years ago in a rockfall. I heard the news myself." "Heard from whom?" Astrid asked quietly. The implication hung between them like smoke from green wood. If Tormund hadn't died, if he had been captured or turned, then Magnus possessed detailed knowledge of every defensive feature the hall contained. Outside, the debate between patience and action continued. "The longer we wait, the more chance they have to prepare surprises," Grim argued. "These old halls sometimes contain more than meets the eye, which is precisely why we proceed carefully," Hakon replied. "Dead men tell no tales, but neither do they reveal hidden caches or secret allies." The casual discussion of their impending murder sent cold rage coursing through Bjorn's veins. These men spoke of ending lives as easily as discussing the weather, with the casual confidence of those who had never faced real consequences for their actions. "Bjorn Ketilsson," Hakon called again. "Your time has expired. Will you surrender the fugitives, or must we take sterner measures?" Bjorn looked at Astrid and Eilif, these unlikely allies who had transformed his empty existence into something worth defending. The old woman stood straight, despite her fear, while her husband clutched the ring that represented everything they had lost. They were ready to face death with dignity, asking nothing more than that their sacrifice have meaning. But Bjorn had spent too many years alone, nursing grief and rage in equal measure. The thought of losing these newfound connections, of returning to the hollow existence of a hermit warrior, was more than he could bear. "I hear you, Hakon," he called back, "but I fear there's been a misunderstanding." "What manner of misunderstanding?" Bjorn drew a deep breath, committing himself to a course that would forever change the trajectory of his life. "You speak of fugitives and criminals, but I see only an old man and woman seeking shelter from the storm. If Jarl Magnus has accusations to make, let him come and make them himself." The challenge hung in the air like a blade poised to fall. Bjorn had just publicly questioned the authority of the most powerful man in the Northern Territories, an act that transformed him from neutral hermit to declared enemy. Bold words from a man hiding behind stone walls. Grim called back. "Will you speak them face to face?" "When I'm ready," Bjorn replied. "Until then, consider yourselves unwelcome guests overstaying their invitation." The response was immediate and violent. A crossbow bolt struck the shutters with force enough to splinter the wood. The time for words had truly passed. The siege of Ketil's hall had begun. The crossbow bolt quivered in the splintered wood like an exclamation point written in iron and fury. Within moments, more projectiles followed, arrows whistling through, gaps in the shutters, spear points probing for weaknesses in the stone walls. Magnus's men had abandoned all pretense of lawful arrest in favor of simple siege warfare. "Down!" Bjorn shouted, pushing Astrid and Eilif away from the windows as a particularly well-aimed arrow carved splinters from the beam above their heads. But even as the hall filled with the sounds of assault, Eilif was moving with purpose. The old man's apparent frailty seemed to fall away like a discarded cloak as he hurried to the eastern wall, running his hands along the carved timbers with practiced familiarity. "Here," he said, pressing against a section that looked identical to every other part of the wall. "Help me with this." Together, Bjorn and Eilif applied pressure to specific points along the carved surface. With a grinding of ancient hinges, a section of the wall swung inward, revealing a narrow passage that led into darkness. "Emergency stores," Eilif explained, reaching into the hidden space. "Food, weapons, even—" His hands found what they sought, and he withdrew a carved stone tablet, its surface covered with the same intricate runic script that decorated the foundation stone. "What is that?" Bjorn asked, ducking as another arrow clattered against the shutters. "The memory stone," Astrid said, her voice filled with reverence. "Eilif's record of every hall he built, every commission he received, every oath of loyalty he witnessed. 20 years of hidden truth." Eilif clutched the stone tablet to his chest as if it were the most precious treasure in the world. "Every betrayal Magnus orchestrated, every family he destroyed, I carved it all here, in the old script that few can read. Names, dates, witnesses who might still live." The significance struck Bjorn like a physical blow. This wasn't just a record of personal grievances. It was a comprehensive accounting of Magnus's crimes, spanning decades of systematic betrayal. In the right hands, such evidence could shatter the Jarl's carefully constructed legitimacy. "Why didn't you use this before?" Bjorn demanded. "Why suffer in exile when you possessed such proof?" "Because proof means nothing without power to act upon it," Astrid replied sadly. "We were refugees, homeless wanderers with no standing before any court. Who would believe the word of dispossessed vagrants against the testimony of a Jarl?" Another volley of arrows struck the hall, and through the gaps in the shutters, Bjorn could hear shouted commands. Magnus's men were organizing for a more coordinated assault, testing the defenses methodically before committing to their final push. "But you're not vagrants," Bjorn said, understanding dawning. "You're the last legitimate witnesses to Magnus's rise. And He hefted his great-grandfather's war hammer, feeling the weight of inherited authority in its balanced steel. "I'm the heir to one of the bloodlines he tried to eliminate." "Exactly," Eilif said, his eyes bright with possibility despite their desperate circumstances. "Together, we represent something Magnus thought he had destroyed forever. Continuity. Living proof that his version of history is a lie." The sound of splintering wood interrupted their conversation. Through the gaps in the shutters, Bjorn could see Magnus's men attempting to force the main door with a heavy ram fashioned from a fallen tree. The ancient oak held, but each blow sent tremors through the entire structure. "They're committed now," Astrid observed. "There's no turning back for any of us." Bjorn moved to examine the defensive positions Eilif had restored, noting how the old man's improvements worked together to create overlapping fields of protection. Every beam, every angle seemed designed with warfare in mind. Not the crude fortification of a desperate hermit, but the sophisticated defense of someone who understood both construction and conflict. "Your grandfather commissioned this hall after the raid on Iron Creek," Eilif said, reading Bjorn's thoughts. "He knew Magnus was growing bolder, more willing to use direct violence. This was meant to be a stronghold for those who would stand against tyranny. Instead, it became a tomb for those same defenders," Bjorn replied grimly. "Not a tomb," Astrid corrected. "A seed, waiting for the right season to grow. Your grandfather planted hope in these stones, even if he didn't live to see it flourish." The ram struck again, and this time the door frame cracked audibly. Through the splintered wood, angry voices called for surrender, promising quick death for those who yielded, and slow agony for those who continued to resist. "They're afraid," Eilif observed with satisfaction. "Listen to their voices. Anger covers fear, always has. They expected easy prey. not a fight. Bjorn studied the memory stone in Eilif's hands, its carved surface catching the firelight like ancient secrets made manifest. What would it take to make this evidence public? To ensure it reaches those who could act upon it? Survival, Astrid said simply, and safe passage to the southern settlements, where Magnus's reach isn't absolute. There are still clan leaders there who remember the old ways, who value honor over expedience. Then we ensure you survive, Bjorn said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute commitment. And if we cannot all escape, then at least the stone must reach safety. Eilif gripped his shoulder with surprising strength. You would risk everything for the testimony of two strangers? Not strangers, Bjorn replied, meeting the old man's eyes. Family. The only family I have left. The word hung between them, heavy with meaning and promise. In the space of a single day, 3 isolated souls had found in each other something they had thought lost forever. Connection, purpose, and the fierce loyalty that came from shared suffering. Another blow from the ram, and the door's hinges groaned in protest. Through the widening gaps, Bjorn could see torchlight and the glint of drawn steel. Magnus's men were preparing for the final assault, gathering courage for the rush that would carry them into the hall. Whatever happens, Astrid said quietly, remember that you chose to stand with us. That choice honors every ancestor whose name is carved in these stones. Bjorn hefted the war hammer, feeling the accumulated weight of generations in its steel head. Outside, the ram struck again, and the sound of splintering wood announced that their sanctuary was about to become a battlefield. But for the first time in years, Bjorn Ketilsson was not facing his enemies alone. And that, he realized, made all the difference between mere survival and something worth dying for. The memory stone would reach safety, or they would all perish in the attempt. There was no middle ground, no compromise that could satisfy both honor and survival. The siege was about to become a battle, and the battle would determine whether justice was merely a word or something worth bleeding for. The door gave way with a sound like thunder splitting stone, and Magnus's men poured through the opening with weapons raised and battle cries on their lips. But instead of finding cowering refugees, they discovered Bjorn Ketilsson standing ready with his great-grandfather's war hammer, while behind him, the 2 elderly figures they sought waited with unexpected dignity. Hold, Hakon commanded as his men spread through the hall. We take them alive if possible. Magnus wants answers before he grants them the mercy of death. It was then that Astrid stepped forward, and as she moved into the firelight, something extraordinary happened. She reached up with trembling fingers and removed a pendant that had been hidden beneath her worn clothing, a pendant that caught the light and threw it back in patterns that made every man in the hall freeze in. Recognition. The blood pendant of House Ketilsson, the royal signet that had been lost when Bjorn's family was destroyed. My lady, Hakon whispered, his weapon lowering despite himself. It cannot be. Astrid drew herself to her full height, and suddenly the ragged wanderer was gone, replaced by someone who carried herself with unmistakable nobility. It can be, and it is, she said, her voice carrying the authority of bloodline and birthright. I am Astrid Ketilsdottir, daughter of Ketil the Strong, and this man you threaten is my grandson. The revelation struck the hall like lightning on a clear day. Bjorn felt his knees nearly buckle as the impossible truth crashed over him. His grandmother, the woman whose death had been reported when he was barely old enough to remember her face, stood before him alive, revealed after decades of presumed death. Impossible, Grim snarled, though his voice carried less conviction than his words. Lady Astrid died in the fire that took the old hall. Everyone knows what Magnus wanted them to know, Eilif interrupted, stepping forward to stand beside his wife. Just as everyone knows that the Ketilsson line died with Einvald. But some truths refuse to stay buried, no matter how deep the grave. Hakon's face had gone pale beneath his weather-beaten features. As Magnus's chief tracker, he would have studied the genealogies of every family the Jarl had targeted. He would know that if Astrid Ketilsdottir still lived, It meant that every legal justification for the destruction of House Ketilsson was built on lies. "You cannot be who you claim," he said, but there was desperation in his voice now. "The pendant could be a forgery, stolen from the ruins." "Could it?" Astrid asked, holding the pendant up to catch the firelight. "Look closely, Håkon the tracker. See the wear patterns on the silver? The way the chain has been mended in 3 places with wire of slightly different thickness. See the small dent near the top, where it struck stone when I fell from my horse as a girl of 12 summers. The details were too specific, too personal to be fabricated. More than that, they were the kinds of intimate knowledge that only the pendant's true owner would possess." Bjorn stared at his grandmother alive and standing before him, and felt 20 years of carefully constructed assumptions crumble into dust. "But the fire," he whispered. "The report said you died in the flames when Magnus's men came for grandfather." "I should have died," Astrid replied, her voice heavy with old pain. "The plan was for me to burn with the hall, to eliminate any trace of legitimacy that might challenge Magnus's version of events. But Eilif—" She reached for her husband's hand. "Eilif had built escape routes even into that hall, passages known only to him. He pulled me from the flames while Magnus's men celebrated their victory. We let them believe she was dead," Eilif added. "It was the only way to keep her safe. A dead woman poses no threat to a usurper's throne." Håkon was shaking his head, trying to deny what his own eyes and experience were telling him. "Even if you are who you claim, it changes nothing. Magnus rules by right of strength and the consent of the clans. Ancient bloodlines mean nothing if they lack the power to assert their claims." "Perhaps," Astrid acknowledged. "But they mean everything when it comes to the legitimacy of past actions. Tell me, Håkon, what happens to Magnus's carefully constructed authority when word spreads that he built his power by murdering a grandmother and her infant grandchildren? When the clans learned that the traitor Ketil was defending his own bloodline against a usurper's ambition?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a green fire. Everyone present understood the implications. Magnus had spent decades crafting a narrative that painted his enemies as threats to legitimate order. If that narrative was revealed as complete fabrication, if he was shown to be not a protector of tradition, but its destroyer, then everything he had built would collapse, like a house made of rotted timber. "Moreover," Eilif said, producing the memory stone from his robes, "we have documentation. 20 years of careful record-keeping, tracking every family destroyed, every oath broken, every lie told to justify murder, written in the old script by one who witnessed it all." Grim lunged forward, reaching for the stone, but Bjorn's warhammer intercepted him with bone-crushing force. The young warrior crumpled to the floor, his arm hanging at an unnatural angle, his face white with shock and pain. "The next man who moves without permission loses more than an arm," Bjorn said quietly. And there was something in his voice that made even seasoned warriors take a step back. "You begin to understand," Astrid said, addressing Håkon directly. "This isn't just about 2 old refugees seeking shelter. This is about the last surviving witnesses to Magnus's crimes, protected by the rightful heir to one of the oldest bloodlines in the Northern Territories." Håkon's mind was clearly racing, calculating odds and consequences. He had come here expecting a simple execution, the elimination of 2 troublesome witnesses. Instead, he faced a situation that could destabilize the entire power structure he served. "What do you want?" he asked finally. "Justice," Eilif replied simply. "A chance for the truth to be heard before impartial judges. A reckoning for crimes that have gone unpunished for too long. And if Magnus refuses—" Astrid smiled, and in that expression Bjorn saw something of his grandfather's legendary determination. Then the memory stone travels south, to clan leaders who remember the old ways, to Jarls who still believe that honor means something. "Magnus may control the Northern Territories, but his reach is not infinite." "You would start a war," Håkon said. "Magnus started the war 20 years ago," Bjorn replied. "We're simply choosing to fight back." The tracker looked around the hall, taking in the defensive preparations, the hidden passages, the evidence of careful planning. His men were outnumbered only in terms of information. They faced not just superior position, but superior knowledge of their enemy's weaknesses. "I cannot simply withdraw," he said finally. "Magnus sent me to complete a task." "If I return empty-handed, then don't return empty-handed," Astrid interrupted. "Return with a proposal." Magnus has spent decades trying to erase the evidence of his crimes. Offer him the chance to confront that evidence directly before witnesses who matter. A trial. "A reckoning," Eilif corrected. "Let him defend his actions before those he claims to serve. Let the truth stand against his lies in fair contest." Hakon considered this, his weathered face reflecting the complexity of his position. To accept would be to admit that Magnus's authority was open to question. To refuse would be to commit his men to a battle that could only end in revelation of the very secrets his master sought to keep buried. "And if I refuse this proposal?" Bjorn hefted his warhammer, feeling the weight of inherited purpose in its steel head. "Then we settle the matter here and now. But know this, Hakon, win or lose, the truth will survive." "We've made certain of that." The implication was clear. Whatever happened in this hall, the evidence would reach those who could act upon it. Magnus's carefully constructed empire of lies was about to face its greatest test. The tracker's hand moved to his weapon, then stopped. Around him, his men waited for orders that would determine not just their immediate fate, but the future of the entire northern realm. The time for half measures was over. Truth and power were about to collide, and only one would emerge intact. The silence that followed stretched like a bowstring drawn to its breaking point. Hakon stood frozen between duty and revelation, his hand hovering over his weapon while his mind wrestled with implications that could reshape everything he thought he knew about the man he served. Finally, the tracker stepped back, his decision made. "Lower your weapons," he commanded his men. "We withdraw to consider terms." Grim, still cradling his broken arm, looked up in disbelief. "You can't be serious. Magnus will have our heads anyway if we return with news he doesn't want to hear." Hakon cut him off. "The question is whether we die for following orders blindly or for bringing him intelligence that might save his reign." As Magnus's men filed out of the hall, Bjorn felt his legs nearly give way beneath him. The warhammer slipped from nerveless fingers as the full weight of revelation crashed over him. His grandmother, alive, standing before him after decades of believing her dead. "Grandmother," he whispered, and the word felt strange on his tongue. Rusty from disuse, Astrid moved toward him, her steps careful but determined. When she reached him, she raised her hand to touch his face, tracing the lines that years of hardship had carved there. "You have your grandfather's eyes," she said softly, "and your father's stubborn chin. But the heart?" She pressed her palm against his chest. "The heart is your own, and it chose well today." Eilif approached more slowly, his aged frame betraying the toll that revelation and confrontation had taken. "I helped build the cradle you slept in as a babe," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Carved runes of protection into every slat, praying they would keep you safe when we could not." The image hit Bjorn like a physical blow. Himself as an infant, surrounded by the love and hope of grandparents he had never known he possessed. "All these years," he said, his voice breaking, "all these years I thought I was alone." "You were never alone," Astrid replied firmly. "Every day of our exile we carried you in our hearts. Every time we heard news of the mountain hermit who troubled Magnus's sleep, we knew our grandson lived. Magnus knows about me. Magnus knows about everyone who might threaten his carefully constructed lies," Eilif said grimly. "Why do you think he's never moved directly against you? A hermit poses no threat, but a rightful heir, surrounded by witnesses to his crimes. That's a different matter entirely. Outside, they could hear the sound of Magnus's men setting up a temporary camp, the scrape of steel on stone as weapons were sharpened, the low murmur of voices discussing tactics and possibilities. Hakon was buying time, but time for what? "He'll send word to Magnus," Bjorn said, moving to peer through the damaged shutters. "Whatever decision is made, it won't be Hakon's to make." "Good," Astrid said with surprising firmness. Let Magnus come. Let him face the truth he's spent decades trying to bury. Eilif had moved to a corner of the hall where ancient weapons hung from wooden pegs, not just the hidden cache they had discovered, but older pieces that had been here since the hall's construction. He selected a curved horn bound with silver bands, its surface carved with intricate patterns that seemed to move in the firelight. "The war horn of House Ketilsson," he said, hefting the instrument with reverence. "Your great-great-grandfather carried this when he united the mountain clans against the raiders from the Eastern Sea." "It hasn't sounded in 40 years. You mean to call our allies?" Bjorn asked. "What allies?" Astrid replied pragmatically. "Magnus has spent decades ensuring that anyone who might answer such a call is either dead, discredited, or too frightened to act." "Not everyone," Eilif said, his eyes holding a glimmer of hope that Bjorn hadn't seen before. "The dispossessed, the exiled, the families scattered by Magnus's ambition. They're out there, surviving in the margins, waiting for a sign that resistance is possible." Bjorn studied the horn, feeling the weight of history in its carved surface. "And you think they'll come?" "I think they'll come for her," Eilif said, nodding toward Astrid. "The blood of Ketil the Strong still commands loyalty among those who remember honor. And they'll come for you, the last legitimate heir to a bloodline that once protected them." The idea was both terrifying and exhilarating. For years, Bjorn had lived as a ghost, avoiding entanglements that might draw unwanted attention. The thought of deliberately summoning every enemy Magnus had ever made, of placing himself at the center of a conflict that could reshape the northern territories. "It's madness," he said finally. "Yes," Astrid agreed with a smile. "The same madness that led your grandfather to challenge impossible odds because it was the right thing to do. The same madness that kept us alive through 20 years of exile, hoping for this moment." Eilif moved to the window, studying the positioning of Magnus's men. "They're not trying to maintain a siege," he observed. "They're waiting for reinforcements. Hakon knows he doesn't have enough men to assault a prepared position, especially now that he understands what's at stake." "How long before Magnus arrives?" Bjorn asked. "Days, perhaps a week," Astrid replied. "Long enough for word to spread if we're clever about it. Long enough for old loyalties to stir and old grievances to remember their bite." Bjorn picked up the war horn, feeling its familiar weight settle into his hands as if it belonged there. The silver bands were tarnished with age, but the horn itself remained sound, ready to carry its call across the mountain peaks. "If I sound this," he said slowly, "there's no going back. Every choice I've made to stay hidden, to avoid entanglements, all of that ends. All of that ended the moment you chose to shelter us," Eilif pointed out. "The only question now is whether we face what's coming with dignity or desperation." Through the window, Bjorn could see smoke rising from Magnus's camp, the glow of fires that would burn through the night while hard men discussed harder choices. By morning, riders would be racing south to carry word to their master. Within days, this isolated mountain peak would become the center of a storm that had been building for 20 years. "Tell me about the families," Bjorn said finally. "The ones you think might answer the call." Astrid and Eilif exchanged glances, and Bjorn saw decades of shared memory pass between them. "The Raven's Hollow clan," Astrid began. "Magnus accused their patriarch of cattle theft, had him hanged and his sons banished. But the daughter married into the Ironwood family, and their children would be grown now." "The Stormbreak line," Eilif added. "Magnus claimed their coastal holdings were forfeit due to unpaid taxes, but we witnessed the payment ourselves. 3 generations scattered to the wind, but some survived, and others," Astrid continued. "Families whose names Magnus erased from official records, but whose blood remembers. Whose children heard stories of what they lost and why." The catalogue of suffering went on, each name a testament to Magnus's systematic destruction of anyone who might challenge his authority. But with each name came the possibility of resistance, of justice long delayed, but not denied. "They'll come," Bjorn said with growing conviction. "If they know the truth is finally being told, if they see a chance to reclaim what was stolen, they'll come." "Some will," Eilif agreed. Enough, perhaps, to make Magnus think twice about simply crushing us with overwhelming force. And if they don't come? If fear proves stronger than hope? Astrid smiled with the serenity of someone who had already made peace with the worst possibilities. Then we three will stand together as family should and face whatever comes with our heads held high. That's more than many get, and more than we had yesterday. The simplicity of her acceptance humbled him. For years, Bjorn had lived with the weight of survivor's guilt, wondering if he could have done something to save his parents and sisters. Now faced with the opportunity to honor their memory through action rather than brooding, he felt a clarity of purpose that had been absent from his life for too long. "When?" he asked, hefting the war horn. "Now," Eilif said firmly. "Before Magnus has time to position his pieces, before fear has time to take root. Let the sound carry across the peaks while hope still burns bright." Bjorn moved to the window, drawing a deep breath that seemed to fill not just his lungs, but his entire being. The horn felt alive in his hands, eager to sing its ancient song of defiance and solidarity. Outside, Magnus's men looked up from their fires as the first pure note rang out across the mountain peaks, clear and strong and unmistakable in its meaning. The war horn of House Ketilsson was sounding again, calling the scattered and the lost to remember their names. The sound echoed from peak to peak, carrying its message far beyond the reach of sword or spear. Somewhere in the distance, in hidden valleys and forgotten places, the dispossessed would hear that call and remember that they were not as alone as they had believed. The reckoning Magnus had spent 20 years trying to prevent was finally beginning. 3 days passed before the first riders appeared on the horizon, their approach heralded by dust clouds that spoke of urgent travel and desperate hope. Bjorn watched from his window as the scattered remnants of Magnus's victims made their way up the treacherous mountain path. Drawn by the ancient call that had echoed across the peaks, they came in small groups, a family here, a handful of warriors there, survivors who had learned to move carefully and trust slowly. But they came nonetheless, and with each arrival, Bjorn felt the weight of inherited responsibility settling more firmly on his shoulders. "The Raven's Hollow survivors," Astrid said, identifying a group of riders as they dismounted near the base of the peak. 3 sons and a daughter, all grown to fighting age since their father's execution. "And there," Eilif added, pointing to another group making camp in the valley below. "Stormbreak clan badges, though they're careful not to display them openly. Magnus's reach makes even ancestral symbols dangerous." By sunset of the 3rd day, nearly 40 souls had answered the horn's call. Not an army by any measure, but something perhaps more dangerous, a gathering of witnesses, each carrying memories of injustice that Magnus had thought safely buried. It was then that the true test began. Magnus Ironhand arrived at dawn of the 4th day, and his approach could not have been more different from that of the refugees. Where they had come with hope and desperation, he came with the overwhelming certainty of absolute power. 100 mounted warriors followed in his wake, their armor gleaming in the morning sun, their banners snapping in the mountain wind. The Jarl himself rode at their head, and even at a distance, Bjorn could see why Magnus had commanded loyalty for so long. Tall and broad-shouldered, with silver threading through hair the color of winter iron, he carried himself with the unconscious authority of one who had never truly been challenged. "He's more impressive than I expected," Bjorn admitted, watching the procession arrange itself in the valley below. "Tyrants often are," Astrid replied calmly. "It's how they convince good people to follow them down dark paths." Magnus's voice carried clearly up the mountainside when he finally spoke, amplified by the natural acoustics of the valley. "Bjorn Ketilsson," he called, "I come under flag of truce to discuss terms. Will you meet me as a warrior should, or hide behind stone walls like a coward?" The challenge was calculated, designed to provoke rash action. But Bjorn had spent years learning patience in the harsh embrace of the mountains. "I hear you, Magnus," he called back, "but I see no equals here. You bring 100 swords to speak with 3 souls. What manner of courage is that?" A ripple of laughter came from the gathered refugees. The first time many of them had heard someone speak to Magnus with anything approaching mockery. The sound seemed to carry more weight than any weapon. "Then let us speak as equals," Magnus replied after a moment's pause. "You and I, with witnesses from both sides. Let us settle this matter with words before it comes to steel." Eilif nodded approvingly. "He's trapped himself. In front of all these witnesses, he can't simply order an attack. He has to at least pretend to offer justice, but he'll have conditions," Astrid warned. "Magnus never enters any negotiation without stacking the odds in his favor." As if summoned by her words, Magnus's voice rang out again. "I propose single combat to settle the matter. You claim to be wronged. Prove it with blade and sinew. If you prevail, I will hear your accusations before assembled witnesses. If I prevail," he paused dramatically, "the matter ends here and order is restored." The challenge hung in the air like smoke from a signal fire. Single combat, the ancient way of settling disputes when words failed and politics became too tangled for simple solutions. It was a trap, of course. Magnus was a proven warrior in his prime, while Bjorn was a hermit who had spent years avoiding conflict rather than seeking it. "Don't do it," one of the Raven's hollow sons called up from the valley. "He's never lost a single combat. The man fights like a berserker possessed." But Bjorn was already moving toward his weapons, his decision made before conscious thought could interfere. "I accept," he called down to Magnus, "but not here, where the footing favors neither side. Meet me at the stone circle below the southern peak. Let the old gods witness what justice looks like." The stone circle, a ring of ancient monoliths that predated even the oldest clan memories. Neutral ground where no man could claim advantage of terrain or position. It was the traditional site for formal duels, chosen specifically because it belonged to no one and everyone. "Agreed," Magnus replied, and there was something like satisfaction in his voice. 1 hour hence, bring whatever witnesses you choose. Let all see how challenges to rightful authority end." As the Jarl's words echoed off the mountain walls, Bjorn felt the gathered refugees below, looking up at him with a mixture of hope and terror. He had just committed himself to single combat with the most dangerous warrior in the Northern Territories, staking not just his own life, but the lives of everyone who had answered his call. "Are you certain about this?" Astrid asked quietly, though her voice carried pride alongside concern. Bjorn hefted his great-grandfather's warhammer, feeling the weight of inherited purpose in its perfectly balanced steel. "No," he admitted, "but certainty is a luxury we can't afford. Sometimes you have to act on faith and hope the gods favor the just." Outside, Magnus's men were already breaking camp, preparing for the short journey to the stone circle. Within the hour, 20 years of injustice would be settled by strength of arm and purity of heart. The shield wall of witnesses would determine whether justice finally triumphed or whether tyranny would crush the last hope of the dispossessed. The stone circle stood ancient and impassive against the grey sky, its weathered monoliths bearing witness to countless generations of conflict and resolution. As Bjorn approached the sacred ground, he could feel the weight of history in the air. How many men had walked this path before him, seeking justice or revenge in the crucible of single combat? Magnus was already waiting within the circle, his armor gleaming despite the overcast day. The Jarl had shed his traveling cloak to reveal mail of exceptional quality, each ring perfectly fitted and polished to mirror brightness. At his side hung a sword that spoke of master craftsmanship, longer than most, with a blade that seemed to drink light rather than reflect it. "So," Magnus said as Bjorn entered the circle, "the hermit emerges at last. I had wondered when you would grow tired of hiding in the mountains like a wounded bear, and I had wondered when you would grow tired of hunting old women and defenseless builders," Bjorn replied, hefting his warhammer with careful deliberation. "But it seems we've both found our answers today." Around the circle's perimeter, witnesses gathered in a formation that unconsciously mimicked the shield walls of ancient battles. On one side stood Magnus's men, professional warriors in matching gear, their faces impassive as carved stone. On the other, the ragged collection of survivors who had answered the horn's call formed their own line. Determination etched in every weathered face. Between them, Astrid and Eilif had positioned themselves where both sides could see them clearly. The blood pendant gleamed at Astrid's throat, while Eilif held the memory stone like a sacred relic. They were living proof of Magnus's crimes, and their very presence transformed this from a simple duel into something approaching a trial. "Before we begin," Magnus said, his voice carrying to every witness, "let all understand what stands at stake. I'm accused of crimes against the rightful order, accusations made by exile and outlaw, supported by forged documents and false tokens." "Nothing false about these scars," called one of the Stormbreak survivors, pulling back his sleeve to reveal the mark of a slave brand. "Nothing forged about the chains you put on free men, or the graves you filled with innocent blood," added a Raven's Hollow daughter, her voice cutting through the mountain air like a blade. Magnus's face darkened, but he maintained his composure. "Pretty words from pretty speakers, but words are wind. Let steel speak truth as it always has." The formal challenge required response, and Bjorn stepped forward to offer it. "I stand for House Ketilsson and all who were wronged by your ambition. I stand for the scattered and the lost, the murdered and the dispossessed. Let the gods judge between us." The ancient words seemed to resonate in the stone circle, awakening something that had slept in these monoliths for generations. Even Magnus's hardened warriors shifted uneasily, as the air itself seemed to thicken with expectation. Then steel rang against steel, as Magnus drew his sword, and the time for words passed into legend. The Jarl attacked immediately, his blade seeking Bjorn's throat in a strike meant to end the combat before it could truly begin. But years of survival in the harsh mountains had honed reflexes that proved equal to the challenge. Bjorn's hammer swept up to deflect the blow, and the impact sent shockwaves through both combatants. Magnus was fast, faster than a man his size had any right to be. His sword wove patterns in the air that spoke of decades of practice and countless victories. But Bjorn had advantages the Jarl hadn't expected. The Warhammer's reach gave him options that Magnus's sword could not match, while the mountain-bred strength in his shoulders powered blows that could crush bone through even the finest mail. "You fight well for a hermit," Magnus grunted as their weapons clashed again. "But skill without purpose is meaningless. What do you hope to accomplish here?" "Justice," Bjorn replied, his hammer's head seeking Magnus's ribs with devastating force. "Something you've forgotten the meaning of." The blow connected partially, sending Magnus staggering backward, but not down. The Jarl's mail held, but the impact was clearly felt. For the first time, uncertainty flickered in Magnus's eyes as he realized this would not be the easy victory he had anticipated. Around the circle, the witnesses pressed closer, their voices rising in encouragement or concern as the battle's momentum shifted back and forth. This was more than entertainment. This was the settlement of a debt 20 years in the making. Magnus recovered quickly, his sword darting forward in a series of cuts designed to overwhelm his opponent's defenses. But Bjorn had learned patience in his years of exile, and patience served him well now. He gave ground when necessary, absorbed punishment when he must, and waited for the opening that would decide everything. It came when Magnus overextended himself in a thrust meant to penetrate Bjorn's guard. The hammer's counterattack caught the Jarl in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his sword flying from nerveless fingers. Suddenly, Magnus knelt disarmed before the Judgment Stone, with Bjorn standing over him like an avatar of long-delayed justice. The moment of truth had arrived. The silence that followed the clatter of Magnus's sword was absolute, as if the mountain itself held its breath, waiting for what would come next. Bjorn stood over the defeated Jarl, his warhammer raised for the killing blow that would end 20 years of tyranny with a single stroke. "Do it," Magnus said quietly, his voice carrying neither plea nor defiance, only resignation. "Finish what your grandfather started. Take your revenge and be done with it." But instead of striking, Bjorn lowered his weapon slowly, deliberately. Revenge was your way, he said, his voice carrying to every witness around the circle. Justice will be mine. He turned to face the gathered crowd, seeing hope and fear warring in equal measure on their weathered faces. Magnus Ironhand, he called formally. You stand accused before these witnesses of murder, betrayal, theft of lands and titles, and the systematic destruction of noble bloodlines. How do you answer? The question hung in the air like smoke from a sacred fire. By the ancient laws, a defeated warrior could choose death with honor or confession with shame. Magnus had spent decades avoiding both options, but the circle of judgment stones offered no escape from truth. I answer that I did what was necessary, Magnus replied, struggling to his feet, but maintaining his dignity despite defeat. The old ways were failing. The clans fought among themselves, while real threats gathered beyond our borders. Someone had to unite them under strong leadership, by murdering the rightful leaders. Astrid stepped forward, the blood pendant at her throat catching the light. By destroying families whose only crime was possessing legitimate authority. By eliminating those who would have led us all to destruction through their pride and short-sightedness, Magnus shot back. Your husband, he pointed at Eilif. Your husband built pretty halls for pretty speeches while raiders gathered strength in the east. Your grandson's grandfather spoke of honor while his people starved. Lies, Eilif said firmly, producing the memory stone and holding it high for all to see. 20 years of careful record-keeping says otherwise. Every accusation you made, every justification you offered, documented here in the old script that few can forge. Magnus's face went pale as he stared at the carved tablet. That should have been destroyed. I made certain, you made certain of many things, Bjorn interrupted. But you forgot that builders know how to hide their most precious creations. Tell me, Magnus, when you look around this circle, what do you see? The Jarl's eyes swept the gathered witnesses, taking in faces he had thought safely silenced forever. I see the past refusing to stay buried. I see the future refusing to be denied, Bjorn corrected. Every family you scattered, every bloodline you tried to extinguish, they survived. They endured. They remembered. And now they're here to witness justice finally done. One of the Raven's Hollow sons stepped forward, his young face hard with inherited grief. My father died on your orders, branded a thief for protecting his own cattle from your tax collectors. What justice exists for that crime? And my sisters, added a Stormbreak daughter, sold into slavery to pay debts that existed only in your ledgers. Where is their justice? The accusations continued, witness after witness stepping forward to name their losses and demand acknowledgement. Magnus stood silent through it all, his proud bearing gradually crumbling under the weight of accumulated testimony. Finally, when the last voice had spoken, Bjorn raised his hand for silence. Magnus Ironhand, he said formally, the witnesses have spoken. The evidence stands clear. By what right do you claim authority over people you have wronged so grievously? By right of strength, Magnus replied, but his voice had lost its conviction. By right of necessity. By right of... He stopped, seeming to realize how hollow his justification sounded in the face of so much documented suffering. Then let strength judge you, Bjorn said quietly. But not the strength of sword and steel, the strength of mercy over vengeance, of justice over revenge. He turned to address the gathered witnesses. What say you all? What justice serves the future better than the past? The question provoked immediate debate among the survivors. Some called for blood, for Magnus to pay with his life for the lives he had taken. Others argued for exile, for the stripping of titles and lands that would leave him powerless but breathing. But it was Astrid who provided the answer that would define the new order. Let him live, she said clearly, but let him live as witness to what he destroyed. Let him spend his remaining years seeing the families he scattered rebuild, the bloodlines he tried to extinguish flourish, the justice he perverted restored. A lifetime of watching his work undone, Eilif agreed with grim satisfaction. A lifetime of knowing that truth proved stronger than lies. Magnus looked around the circle one final time, seeing the future written in the determined faces of those he had wronged. And who will lead this new order? Who will take responsibility for what comes next? Bjorn felt the weight of every gaze upon him, the expectation and hope of generations pressed into a single moment. The rebuilt hearth of his family's legacy waited to be lit, but only if he proved worthy of the flame. "We will," he said simply, gesturing to encompass not just himself, but every soul who had answered the horn's call. Together, as our ancestors intended, not as subjects following a single ruler, but as free clans united by choice rather than fear. The warhammer felt lighter in his hands as he set it aside, choosing the tools of building over the instruments of destruction. Around him, the witnesses began to smile, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence as they realized that the long nightmare was finally over. In the months that followed, Magnus would indeed serve as witness to his own legacy's dismantling. The scattered families would return to their ancestral lands. The hidden truths would be carved in stone for future generations to remember, and the northern clans would prosper under a covenant of mutual protection rather than absolute rule. And in the mountain hall where it all began, 3 generations of the Ketilsson line would work together to rebuild not just their own legacy, but the very idea of justice itself. The cold hearth had become warm again, the broken bloodlines had been restored, and the memory of tyrants would serve as warning rather than model for those who came after. The mountain hermit was gone forever, replaced by something the North had not seen in 20 years, a protector who understood that true strength came not from breaking others, but from helping them rebuild what they had lost.